Hello, my name's Marcos Patrick, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and this is the final video in my series on marijuana or cannabis, particularly its medical uses. Disclaimer at the top of the video, just going to say it again, I do not advocate or promote the use of illegal drugs. This video is for informational purposes only, and it may be useful, of course, specifically to people who are living in areas of the world where cannabis is available legally for medical use. Otherwise, it is for educational purposes. Anyway, right, just to get into the video. This last one, the previous videos were all the science stuff. So all the just extrapolations from and explanations of the pharmacology, the clinical uses, the indications, the dosage forms, and all that sort of practical stuff about how cannabis can be used in practice in medicine and specifically in cancer, or at least in theory. This last video is a bit more esoteric. It's the non-sciencey bit. So any of you science buffs who are offended by things like magical thinking and astrology and symbolism, you may wish to not watch this video. If you like that kind of thing, then please go ahead and watch it. Cannabis traditionally was regarded as a cold and dry drug. So what does that mean? That's cold and dry is not a physical description, it's a metaphorical description, and it's an empirical one, meaning it's a sort of trial and error based practical description of its effects. And that's in the Galenic system. That means it's in the Western humoral system, which originated from the Greek Aristotelian, originated by Aristotle, philosopher, 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water, hot, cold, damp, dry sort of system. And then it was evolved into this whole sort of dogmatic medical hypothesis that predominated for our 2,000 years by the Roman physician Claudius Galen, from where we get the word Galenic. And in the Galenic system, cannabis was cold and dry. So that means cold drugs or substances were things which reduced fever and could reduce physical activity or predispose to inactivity and generally slow things down. And dry substances were ones which could literally dry out the body, but cold and dry together meant that cannabis was a melancholic drug. So that meant that it augmented or increased the melancholic humour in the body somewhat. So what that meant in Galenic terms was, because they had this whole humoral system where they saw the human body as being comprised of 4 humours, which I wouldn't look at as literal substances, although back in the day they did think they were literal substances, but they would be blood, phlegm. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, melancholy was cold and dry, and choler was hot and dry. So melancholy was cold and dry, and its function in the body was to retain or hold on to stuff. Too much of it could produce madness, could drive you mad, or could produce depression. But too little of it could make you flighty, unreliable, scattered, anxious, whatever. So cannabis was a drug which slightly augmented melancholy. In other words, it could help in some way retention, it could help reduce anxiety or flightiness, but an excess of it potentially could cause madness, which is very interesting given some of the scientific research on cannabis and its effect on sort of suppressing inflammation, helping with anxiety, sometimes with sleep disorder, but also being a risk factor for inducing schizophrenia or psychosis, potentially. Certainly high doses of the more psychoactive varieties of cannabis can induce a temporary psychosis. So cannabis was also recognised or described in medieval times as a Saturnine drug. That in medieval times they used to classify pretty much everything in astrological terms, but drugs specifically. So medicinal drugs of Saturn were often quite useful, but often poisonous, and certainly things that you It was a category of drug which was cold, usually drugs which were cold and dry, or had effects on the bones, the skin, the spleen, which we would now call perhaps the immune system, and sometimes the teeth, and which would maybe improve retention in some way, and maybe suppress inflammation in some way, and which were often toxic. So it's interesting, side note, that most of the drugs in the modern pharmacopoeia, most of the pharmaceutical drugs that we extract from plants in the medieval sort of taxonomic system of medicines would have been taken from plants of Saturn and Mars. That was the two naughty planets. They symbolized things which were quite violent or poisonous in their action. Saturn was slow poisons, Mars was fast poisons. And almost none of the pharmaceutical drugs that we extract from plants are derived from the medicinal plants which in medieval times would have been seen to be the most useful. That's plants of Jupiter and Venus, the two benefic planets. Drugs which would have been categorized under those planets as being ruled by those planets in the medieval system were more useful, broadly speaking, and much less toxic on the whole. There are exceptions, but so drugs of Jupiter like milk thistle, like dandelion root, like lemon balm, or drugs of Venus like marshmallow or daisies, or my mind's going blank, but they were generally not always, but slightly more food grade, particularly the drugs of Jupiter. And of course, when you're fishing for pharmaceutically active compounds, when you extract single compounds from such plants, they tend not to be that useful. It's the plant as a whole, when used regularly, that may have more of a tonic or supportive effect on the system in whatever way it works. But herbs of Saturn and Mars, the naughty planets, those plants usually contain very powerful and sometimes violently active chemicals. So of course, if you're fishing for drugs, if you want single substances which act really powerfully and produce an immediate impact on the organism, then you're going to use those, which I find really interesting. It just shows that the modern system is focused on attacking and the sort of more extreme end of the drug spectrum, and the traditional emphasis was on sort of preserving life. I'm not saying that the medieval medicine was better than modern medicine. I think modern medicine wins hands down, but I do think the medievals had some ideas that we shouldn't be so quick to discard. We've got to be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's enormous hubris, arrogance in a lot of thinking, just of humans throughout history, where we tend to think that our ideas are the only right ones, and most of the historical ideas were stupid. And we seem to have that, as a human race, we seem to have that trope throughout history. Anyway, massive tangent. Point is, cannabis, Saturn, so it would have been regarded as a drug which would have cooled and repressed and contained, but which could potentially produce insanity in excess or whatever. Hemp, the Cannabis ruderalis, the non-psychoactive species of cannabis, was in fact used to make cords and nooses and sails and stuff like that, which are very Saturnine things, but things of practical use, things which were rough and sort of in common daily use, and were used to bind things, which is a very Saturnine function in medieval thinking. And of course, cannabis, the psychoactive species, cannabis sativa or cannabis indica particularly, are regarded as narcotics. I mean, they're not technically narcotics, but in the sense that they are psychoactive. They can induce a kind of delirium in high doses. They're analgesic or painkilling, or at least anodyne. They lower pain, and cannabis does suppress immunity. Ergo, it does have this sort of suppressive, cooling, numbing effect that was characteristic of drugs that were classified under Saturn. Whether or not you believe in or give any credence to traditional astrology, which doesn't have the support of science, the classification system, the way that they mentally put things into boxes is interesting, and I think definitely worthy of exploration. And also the ability of Saturnine drugs, particularly cannabis, to increase melancholy. Low doses of melancholy, and I'm quoting Marsilio Ficino, a sort of, I think he was 11th century, maybe 10th century, put it on the screen. He was a Catholic priest and a doctor, also physician, and a very learned man who wrote 3 books on life, De Vita Libri Tres, which is really interesting set of books on sort of medicine and magic and sort of his thinking on things. And he described Saturn as small doses of it, of the things that Saturn represented to the medieval mind, as being important for contemplation and deep thinking, but large doses of Saturn could drive one mad, because one would become too introspective and start thinking too deeply and go a bit crazy. So that's very much a cannabis thing, no? So small amounts of cannabis, very good for associative thinking. People use it, some creative types use it recreationally to improve their creative thinking, but larger doses, possible increased risk of psychosis, and certainly very large doses internally mimic the symptoms and can induce a temporary full-on psychotic episode, or something that's a psychotomimetic, something that resembles one. Things, what else to say about it? I would classify, now this is my classification, not a traditional one. Saturn was traditionally classified, cannabis was traditionally classified as a herb of Saturn and as cold and dry and melancholic. I would also say that it's a herb of Saturn in Pisces. If you were going to put it in an astrological sign traditionally, I would stick it as Saturn in Pisces. Why? Because Pisces traditionally was a cold, moist water sign ruled by Jupiter and Venus, the 2 good planets. So what that means, Jupiter and Venus are the planets of pleasure and joy. Venus rules the breast and genitals, and Jupiter rules the lungs and liver. And we know that Saturn, the naughty planet, we know that it actually inhibits fertility, and that when you smoke it, the tars might do bad things to your lungs. And we know that it increases lipogenesis, the production of fats in the blood. It sort of has a slightly naughty effect on all of those bits, but it's also used for pleasure and creativity, which is traditionally a very sort of Pisces domain. Also, traditionally, Pisces in astrological language was the sign where Mercury, which represented the nerves, the nervous system, the brain, was in detriment and fall, was very much afflicted. So Saturn in this sign might be expected to reduce or numb or remove spasms in the nerves, or in some way take down, suppress strongly mercurial activity, excess mercurial activity, but could also aggravate mercurial diseases, which are diseases that come from the imagination, perhaps. So in terms of, to get back into more sort of practical waters, as one might say, I always think about the action of cannabis on the mind, the psychoactive species, as kind of chopping up the thoughts and putting them into separate boxes. So its action on anxiety isn't so much that it takes anxiety away, I don't think, as that it kind of just chops it up and puts it into lots of separate rooms so that somebody's not as aware of it. But it's all still there. It hasn't actually gone away. And in the same way, it chops up patterns of thought and sort of disperses them. So this can make it quite useful for compulsive obsessive disorders. It was traditionally used, I think, in Victorian medicine for obsessive compulsive disorders. It can be useful in some cases for anxiety, but it makes it very bad for schizophrenia or delusional thinking, because that sort of chopping up of the thoughts and sort of floating them out on separate lily pads, so that nothing connects directly anymore, is not good in that case. So essentially, cannabis can negatively impact rationality while augmenting the faculty of imagination. I think Was there anything else I wanted to say? Oh yeah, just a quick mention of hemp seeds. Traditionally, hemp seed milk or emulsion, which you can make just by buying hemp seeds, whizzing them up in a blender with some water, and then straining it, making hemp seed milk, was drunk for inflammation in the bowel and to stop. So if heat in the bowel would be symbolized by rapid bowel motions, sometimes maybe with blood. Obviously nowadays you definitely want to get a diagnosis if that was happening. You want to check that nothing really serious was going on. But for those kinds of symptoms, hemp milk was used, and again that's a very Saturnine thing, to cool and bind. And I've used that in 1 or 2 clients, and very notably I remember a couple of years ago a lady came in with several inflammatory problems, but one of her most troublesome symptoms was this sort of constant tendency to diarrhea and sort of this feeling of heat in her abdomen. And she'd had colonoscopies and investigations, and there was nothing serious going on. There's no colon cancer, there was no colitis, there wasn't heavy inflammation down there. But occasionally she did get blood in her stool. It wasn't from hemorrhoids, it wasn't fresh red blood. Anyway, too graphic, whatever. The point is, hemp milk really helped her. So from a traditional point of view, cramps and feelings of cold in the abdomen, the kind of thing where you want to put a hot water bottle on it, hemp milk would not be indicated for that, because cramps were a cold symptom. And obviously if it's something you want to put a hot water bottle onto to relax everything, that's, you want warmth. But for things where the bowels may be too active and there's a feeling of heat, hemp milk might be worth a try. It, you know, couldn't do any harm unless you're allergic to cannabis, in which case don't use it. Anyway, bit of a rambly ending. What's new? That's fine. Hope you liked this video. Hope it was interesting to you. If it was, please like, subscribe, share, do the things, and I'll see you next time. Bye.